So I want to kind of jump into everything, and just, for people watching, listening, if you could just kind of introduce yourself and tell a little bit about what you do and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, so I'm Thacker, and I presently work in private practice as I'm a licensed psychotherapist now in New York, but also in Virginia. And I started out as an art therapist. My master's degree is in art therapy, which I got like in 2002, so a long time ago. And in 2011, I went through the health coach training program at IIN and was planning to kind of transition and just become a health coach, because I was like a little burnt out from doing a lot of years of intensive therapy and therapeutic day treatment and stuff like that. And through the years, I'd also become a yoga teacher, which I did for myself more personally, just because that was my own outlet for anxiety and whatnot. And so throughout that process of becoming a health coach, where I started doing more of holistic work and integrating more nutrition and kind of mindfulness and other pieces into therapeutic practice, I had a lot of people reaching out who were looking for the integrative approach, who were saying, like, I've tried every diet out there and nothing seems to work, or I don't understand why. I know what to eat, but I don't do it. Or I understand like what I need to do, but I don't have any motivation, or I just feel like I'm emotionally in stress eating all the time. And so I really at that time transitioned my work into mainly I focus on working with those who struggle with emotional eating or somewhere on the eating disorder spectrum. And then I also see people for anxiety, depression, trauma, history, PTSD, things like that as well. But I have a good bulk of people that I work with who
Yeah.
on food stuff.
Yeah. And you were able to kind of pull in your art background too. I mean, you have an amazing book, Holistic Food Therapy, right? And that you incorporate kind of the art side of it. So can you tell people a little bit more about that? Because I just find that so fascinating.
Yeah, so I incorporated in the book Holistic Food Therapy, it's a workbook and expressive journal where you're really working through sort of what is your vision for your relationship with food and essentially your relationship with yourself, and then how do you process some of those emotions that have gotten in the way of having a healthy relationship with food and with yourself, or in some form or another there's numbing or avoidance. And so we look at using art as an outlet to understand and explore our internal world. And so in the book there's little mandalas. So mandala is just a circle, and so within that space it's representative of the wholeness of ourselves. And so there's an opportunity to just kind of be creative in terms of the directives that are in there around the concepts of an emotion that might feel uncomfortable, like for many people anger or grief or guilt, or all these feelings that we tend to kind of feel like, oh, I don't want to have to feel that, I'd rather just avoid it. And then
Right.
so inevitably we find a way to do that avoidance. And for many people that's food, numbing, or just in some form kind of just getting away from the pattern of eating healthfully just for the sake of nourishment, but instead
Mhm.
it's going into that form of emotional eating, stress eating, that becomes this pattern. And then the food becomes an additional solution where it's triggering the pleasure center in the brain. And so then we become addicted, so to speak, in that way. I don't know that we need to think of it in terms of addiction, but it has that tendency
Mhm.
to want more of those foods versus going into what is really right for my body and coming back to our intuitive space.
Right, exactly. And, yesterday, actually, in preparation for our conversation today, I went back and I listened to our initial conversation that we really took a deep dive into all of this having to do with the emotional eating side of things and action steps you can take and why it occurs biologically, physiologically, emotionally, things like that. And it's so good that I'm probably going to reshare that as well. So if people want to learn a little bit more about that deeper side of things, I'm going to encourage them to go and listen to that webinar, which will be kind of included with this article too.
Great.
So I want to kind of skip over all of that and kind of talk about emotional eating in the time of COVID,
Yeah.
because I'm sure you have seen and heard a lot of people struggling with that. And I know that early on, like quarantine was kind of in full fledged, right? And I went down a rabbit hole on Instagram. One of my friends who's a very inspiring influencer, if you will, she has a big audience, and she had kind of put this question up on one of her stories about like, how are you dealing with quarantine? And I saw so many responses. She later posted the responses, and I saw so many responses of people dealing and struggling with overeating. Whether they had had a history of emotional eating prior wasn't clear, but it seems as if that didn't even really matter, that even people who didn't were kind of turning to food in order to cope.
Yeah.
So I would be really curious to kind of hear your experience in working with clients during this time, and what you've seen, what you've heard, how you are helping people heal from that.
Yeah, it's really one of the things we have to do, right, is eat. And when we're home and there's not our normal outlets, not our normal opportunities to get outside or maybe to engage socially or whatever else we might do, now there's this opportunity to just eat, right? It's like, that's like, it becomes our pleasure. It's like, oh, well, meals become something that's really our focus. And while yes, we should derive pleasure from food, food is pleasurable and it nourishes us, and we crave things that are both healthy sometimes and not necessarily so all the time. But generally our body, if we're really intuitively paying attention, it knows what we want. And right now, when we're kind of, and I know that, everyone's on different stages and whatnot in terms of being able to get out more, but for a good several months, like particularly up here in New York, we were stuck inside. It was not recommended to leave the house except for essentials, and that was at minimal times if possible. And so to really figure out what else brings you a sense of joy and pleasure was really the focus, with so many people, like myself included, but also people that I work with, where you had to really identify, like, how do you still create community? How do you still stay connected in some way with your, if you have a spiritual practice, or if you have an exercise routine or anything that you used to get out and do that was just part of your normal routine. And now it was like, all that was like, throwing a deck of cards up in the air. It was all scattered. And so how do we start to put it back together? So the morning routine, extremely important. Setting intentions, which, again, it's important already, even when we have to like do our normal kind of day to day. But when you're working from home, or those who weren't working and really anxious, that shift from kind of like, well, I'm in my room and now I'm in this other room and that's work. It's really, how do you create a separation from what is work, what is home? And meal planning and preparation was still really high on the list of prioritizing, because if it's like, oh, what do I want? And so we could do takeout, or we could do, like order all these groceries, or like go to the store. And that was the main, like, what all can we kind of hoard at the time, because everyone was a little nervous in the beginning about food shortages and everything. And so it just became this kind of overconsumption and I think, kind of concern about food. And so, and just as human beings, biologically, like if we're low on food, that's going to trigger some fear response.
Right.
And so I think for so many people, it became this really, really big concern. And so starting with the morning routine, finding engagement with either social outlets or joining like online membership communities and other things where there was still some outlet for preservation of the self, finding joy in non-food ways, and then still finding joy in food, but really being still the same consciousness that we bring to food and mindful eating through the mindfulness process all the time.
Yeah.
So really, so not doing the overconsumption and listening to your body, honoring your hunger, but also respecting when you're full. Those principles we still really, really focus on in terms of intuitive eating and mindfulness.
Yeah. And, to talk about stress a little bit, because I feel like for a lot of people who struggle with emotional eating, majority, I would say that it is a numbing, type thing, something that they turn to numb. So can you talk about that, both from like a physiological perspective and kind of like a mental one, like what's happening in the body physiologically that has people turn to food in order to cope with stress? And then what this does kind of, not only from a biochemistry perspective, but just from that like energetic, emotional perspective as well.
Yeah. So when we go into a stress response, the sympathetic nervous system is aroused. So that's our fight or flight or freeze. And so we are feeling anxious, right? The stress response has been ignited because we don't know what's happening. We're uncertain about the future. We're scared we might get this illness, or someone we care about will, or will I lose my job? Like so many different factors. And so we are then in our mind triggering that response because we're not actually in a threatening circumstance. Or some people may very well be in a threatening circumstance if they have lost their jobs or things like that. But for many of us, it's just a fear that we're perpetuating mentally. And the body responds in the same way, whether it's happening in our mind or whether it's actually happening physically to us. And so if we are catastrophizing in our mind that I might get sick, someone I care about might get sick, this will never end, I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my home. If we're staying in that sensibility of just everything is going to go wrong, that fight or flight is constantly flowing through our system. So that's increase in cortisol and adrenaline. And that if we can catch it early, so when we notice the kind of the surge and the anxiety coming up and we can catch it within about 90 seconds, we can bring it back down fairly quickly, let's say within a minute to 3 minutes or so. If we don't, and we're staying in that state for 10 minutes, an hour, however long that we're really just feeling this anxiety, it can take a lot longer to help to re-regulate our system. And so biologically, then, if we're staying in that state all the time, we're kind of exhausting ourselves. Our adrenals get completely burnt out, and then we don't sleep well. Like it starts to impact all of these other pieces of our well-being because our stress response is just overexcited all the time. And then if we can bring on the parasympathetic nervous system response, which is our rest and digest mode, that allows our body to find that regulation once again and to stay in a state where we're properly digesting and we're in a state of rest. And that's ideally where we want to be unless there's an actual disaster, right? And so, but it's very different. And sure, there's going to be thoughts or fears that are going to come up from time to time, but how do we address those in the moment? And one way that sadly we can turn to, and I've been there and I know we all have, is something that is very soothing. That's why we call them comfort foods. So things like a carbohydrate fix, right? Or pizza. For me, it used to be these eggplant basil rolls that were like, but after feeling really anxious or hyped up, like I would just crave those. And it was obviously not an ideal situation. And to eat those from time to time is great if they taste good, but really feeling that surge of anxiety, most likely you're going to overstuff because that numbing sensation, the avoidance of, or that just kind of like it brings you down, it kind of forces your body into that state of rest, even though you're technically not really resting. It's kind of like it makes you feel that way. And so then those cravings, then it felt like, well, that worked, right? Our body, and we're not like consciously thinking, well, that worked, but our body then just starts to develop that craving cycle for when we're feeling stressed. It's like, ooh, I know it works. And then that also stimulates pleasure center. So we get a surge of dopamine, which makes us feel good. And then it makes it just makes it harder to stop the cycle when that becomes a coping skill for the surge of the stress response.
Right. And those, kind of neural pathways in your brain, just those grooves get deepened. And so even with, unconsciousness, you'll continue to choose the same pattern of behavior, even if you aren't aware that that's what you're doing.
Exactly.
And, and formally, when I was health coaching, a lot of my clients kind of described it as that like autopilot. Like it was like they had kind of blacked out, and then all of a sudden they were elbow deep in, chips or whatever they chose as their comfort food. And then it's almost like they came to. So can you explain that phenomenon a little bit?
Yeah, that goes also, that autopilot really is like our brains are somewhat lazy, right? And so when we have that benefit of like creating the morning routine or developing these routines, once we get them settled in, we don't have to think so hard or work so hard or try so hard to do these things that we want to do. But the initial process is really challenging. For it to be something so easy like food, that's something the brain automatically will then just crave because it works so effectively. And, things like mindfulness, meditation, exercise, these other really healthy, beneficial ways of having a healthy stress outlet are so beneficial, but they don't necessarily give the same surge. It's more of a cumulative impact. So we start to see the benefits of meditation over time, not necessarily by sitting and meditating once, right? But we feel the impact of food instantly. And it becomes, so again, it becomes sort of like this miracle drug, even though it's not, but it's just so it has such an instant impact to calm the nervous system, or to make you feel, again, it's not actually calm the nervous system, but it makes you feel calmer in the moment where it helps to reduce the sense of stress or the experience of stress. But it doesn't remove it. It doesn't take it away. It just numbs it.
Yeah. And I want to talk more about meditation in a little bit, but for people who aren't even anywhere near wanting to establish a meditation practice, and they are just kind of at the bare bones of wanting to kind of increase consciousness, right? And just really start to learn how their mind works and the power of their thoughts. I think the very first stage of kind of healing from emotional eating is to even realize that we are separate from our thoughts and that we can actually be an observer of them, which is what meditation helps you practice to do. But, I heard you mention a little bit ago of like kind of disrupting that drift and sort of, if you catch it in the first 90 seconds, that you can sort of take control back and empower yourself in order to make a different choice. So can you talk a little bit more about the power of your thoughts and stories in your mind, and sort of how you can learn to separate yourself from that and create a divide and understand, like, you are not your thoughts, you're not your past behaviors. It doesn't always have to be this way just because that's how it's always been.
Absolutely. Yeah, I see that I kind of got away from your last question. And so, like, when you are in that pattern, how do we disrupt the pattern? For sure is through that, by becoming aware first. So awareness is always the first step. If you're not noticing that you're numbing yourself, then there's no way to change. The awareness of it sometimes is frustrating in the beginning phases because the change process isn't immediate. And so just because we're aware doesn't mean we change behavior. And so, but we do have to be aware in order to change it. So once we recognize, like, oh, there I am, like I'm going in for the second half of this bowl of chips or whatever. Right. And now I'm aware. And so how do I shift the consciousness? How do I care? How do I decide that my vision of having a healthy relationship with food is more valuable than this temporary numbing of this feeling? And so the walking through those steps of change are really powerful by first having that vision. What is it that you really want? And then being able to put yourself into that mind space every single day. And it's a practice that, how will I deal with it when I have a craving? What will I do in the face of a strong emotional experience? What will my plan be for what I'm going to achieve and how I'm going to achieve that today to begin to shift this relationship with food? And then with the thought, so our thought is, I want to change. But if our internalized belief is more like, well, I've tried everything and nothing's worked, so what's the point? Then most likely we're not going to actually take any action and begin to change the behavior. So we really have to challenge those thoughts. And so we recognize, if my thought is, well, nothing's worked, then what does that really mean? That's a story, right? Because so far, maybe nothing has worked, but that doesn't mean that this won't work. That doesn't mean that change isn't possible. So how do we challenge the stories that we tell ourselves based on our past so that we can engage with a new present moment and then, effectively create a new future? The only person that we have control over in this whole wide world is our future self. And yet to take control of our future self is to implement change now. And so if we decide, so there's a lot of questions to ask ourselves kind of in the moment, like, what do I really want? And does this choice align with what I want? And so if the choice doesn't, then why am I going to continue to engage in that? And then being able to, once we recognize and we're aware and we begin to settle some new patterns of behavior that we want, then we have to do the work to create that follow through on a very consistent daily basis, again, because our brains are fairly lazy, and we're going to always fall back unless we are staying on top of it in the present moment with consciousness. And that's where, yes, meditation comes in handy, but that's not the ticket always. It's really, how do I be here now and make a decision now? And that doesn't mean too that we punish ourselves if the decision I make isn't to, to say, does this choice align with my vision? Well, not really, but I'm going for it anyway. To not punish ourselves for that, but just to recognize that it's not a perfect journey. There's always an opportunity for growth, and to really have the plan and then to consistently attempt to be executing our plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you mentioned the morning routine a couple of times and how powerful that can be. So, I imagine there's almost kind of two sides to that coin in the era of COVID, because it's probably on one side easy to establish a routine because you're probably not doing too many different things on a daily basis, but also about how behavior can be associative, right? And so that can probably be a little bit more difficult if you're in the same space and triggered by the same associations that have you undergo similar behavior. And then you bring on that extra layer of the stress piece. Yeah. So what do you find yourself recommending to clients to establish a better morning routine? And what are those things that you are advising that they do to start their day off on the right foot and just to become more mindful and present?
I think it's finding one thing, because we tend to get into this, like, I need to overhaul, or I've got to do everything. And so what is one thing that you want to add to your morning routine that you believe will be useful to set the structure up of your day in a way that you're going to be more mindful, you're going to be more present, you're going to be more intentional about the way that you go through your day. And so if that one thing is adding in some mindfulness, if that one thing is journaling, if that one thing is just one mindful meal, like not having the TV or social media or anything, but whatever that one, or maybe it's exercise or whatever it is, like what sets you up, what kind of like ignites your fire, right? Like it gets you feeling fueled for your day to feel like motivated and ready that, yes, this is going to, I can do this today. I've got it. It's going to be a good day. And, again, things can happen amidst all of that, but what is that one thing that really gives you that little sense of, I got this, I can do it. And so it might be doing some type of self-affirming statements in the morning. It might be really, really simple, like a little gratitude journal. And it might be much larger, where it's like a 20-minute meditation practice. But for everybody, they have to find what is the one thing and then start with that. Once you get that going and it's integrated and you're feeling like it's really been powerful and useful and it's making a difference, or we evaluate it, if it's not, then what else can we implement? But if it is, then we look at, okay, well, what's one more thing to add? Potentially, if you need to, like what would be another layer of change that's going to move you in the direction of what you want, so that we're moving slowly but very intentionally. And so there's not so much pressure. It doesn't feel so overwhelming. And, in the era of COVID especially, it's just something that also gives you a shift from like, this is like the morning and this is now my day, and so allows that transition that's going to feel really healthy for you.
Right. And definitely, and I've always said that the mornings are so important to establish your day on the right foot. And, hearing you speak about everything and bringing it back to food and meals specifically, I think, breakfast or whatever you eat first could be a really great springboard, especially if you struggle with something like emotional eating. And even non-emotional eating, but even I would say less nutritious eating, and you're wanting to make a change in that way. And, if you can bring presence to that first meal, you start to build confidence, right? And proving those stories wrong. And it doesn't have to be like this whole leap of change. Like if you just make like one small change in the morning to your routine or at breakfast with the food that you choose, it can start to break down those stories of, knowing that you can change and empower yourself, because I feel like it just has to be this self-empowerment, if you will, in order to make those steps in the right direction.
Yeah.
So meditation, I mean, you're a yoga teacher, and you know, there's so much resistance around the practice. But you know, and I know in our previous conversation we talked a lot about kind of debunking that, you know, negative connotation around meditation, or it has to look a certain way. So I'm sure in your practice you encourage it a lot with your clients. What do you find is kind of the number one resistance, and then how do you talk people around that? And do you have any stories of people who were like absolutely not turned on to meditation, and then now they are, you know, big converts?
Yeah. I think that meditation or some type of practice that is being quiet and being with yourself, and it can look like whatever that needs to look like for each individual, but that is where that self-empowerment that you just talked about, where that comes from, because that's where we can get internally connected. And our answers are always there. The answers that come from within and our own intuition and guiding through our own inner wisdom is always available. And if you're in that really quiet, connected space and you're not distracted by all the mental noise or the like external noise, you can really ask yourself those questions. Like, does this align with my vision? No, like or yes, like those answers are so clear in those moments.
Right.
And yet if it's like there's a lot of distraction, a lot of external noise, then it's like either I don't know, I'm confused, or I don't really care. And so whenever we get into, or I feel like, well, maybe that's the right thing, or that's the right thing, instead of what's really right for me. And so the meditation practice, I've worked with many people who, a lot of times people are interested in working with me because I come from like, I have like all these different holistic pieces. So they're like, I'm curious about that, but I don't know, you know? And so I haven't had anybody who was like never going to meditate, and then like I convinced them to, and then like, I don't have any miracle stories like that, unfortunately. I had students from my yoga classes that would come to my meditation class and they were like curious about it, and they were like, I hate sitting still, like I don't want to do that, and yet they were like, okay, I got it, like I get that it's, you know, there's something to it, you know. Mm-hmm. And but so just like that's, so I don't have any like great stories the other way, but who start with sort of like, I don't understand it, I don't know, have this kind of mystical view of it, it just becomes so simplified when it's like, what helps you go inward, what helps you check in and stay connected to the present moment, and where you just find these subtle moments of peace or connection with yourself, or this release from all of the mental noise and the external noise. And so for some people that's walking in nature, for some people that's really sitting and being quiet, for some people that's a guided meditation, maybe with a little bit of silence at the end, for some people that's within their yoga practice, but for some people it's, you know, when they're running, they're really, really connected and they're meditating. So they're meditating in that way, or, you know, again, being mindful and really, really completely absorbed in the present moment, which is what the intention of meditation is. And so I feel like it's so powerful, but what I like to do is always practice it with the people that I'm working with, even if it's for 1 minute, just to give them the experience. And I've never had anybody be like, oh, that was torture, you know, or I can't do. They're like, oh, you know, like that was 2 minutes. Like that felt like 10 seconds or whatever. And so I generally guide through that verbally. So I'm talking through and reminders to come back to the present moment or the mindful awareness or whatever we're doing. But most people find that it's the way that they can feel from the 1 minute to the 2 minutes, you know, like just from that meditative process,
right,
tremendously impactful. And they're like, I want more of that, you know, that's what I want to get to. It is hard to be consistent. For many people, it feels like I'm not doing anything. For other people, it's like the mind becomes almost overactive when they're giving it a chance to try to be quiet. It's like, nope, I've got all these thoughts.
Right.
So many challenges that come up in meditation practice, which is why I like to do it with people in the beginning in sessions, and then encourage to practice between sessions, of course, but so that if there's problems or challenges that come up, we can kind of address those head on. so that we can debunk those myths or the challenges and be a little more gentle with ourselves. It's like, it doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't need to
Exactly.
look like
I think self-compassion is just a huge element necessary, if you will, especially if you're really starting to establish a mindfulness practice. And also, finding what works for you. I know that I tried guided meditations for years, and it's something that, off and on, it never really stuck. And I was like, what is it about this? And after, kind of some self-inquiry, I realized that when someone else was guiding me through a meditation, it was almost like an associative trigger to tune out, because maybe like that was just something that I learned, in school growing up. I don't know. So now, I've been meditating pretty consistently with just it's like an insight timer app that just like dings a bell. I'm quiet for like 10 minutes. It dings a bell. And, your mind is going to wander. So I want you to kind of clear up that myth, because people think that it's like, well, my mind would never be clear. And, in my yoga classes and formerly in my health coaching practice, I would always say, like, your mind is not going to completely be clear until you die. Like, it's just like, that's the human brain. So can you clear up that myth that it's about clearing your mind completely?
Absolutely. So that's impossible until,
right.
There are some like meditators maybe who've been practicing for years that, yeah, maybe their mind is quiet for an extended period of time for real. For, let's say, someone who meditates for an hour, and their mind, like maybe after a couple of years of that, their mind is really quiet. So for those of us that have 10 minutes, maybe our mind will be clear for, a few minutes of that, but for the most part, there's still the normal noise. So there's a couple ways to deal with that. So the first is to try to not go in with any expectations. We practice to practice, not for, any other reason, but we know that it's good for us. It gives us space, that interconnection. So not to have a mystical experience, not to be perfect. We practice just to show up for ourselves in practice, so that you're going in without that expectation of an outcome. And so when we take away the outcome that I'm going to clear my mind, well, then that no longer becomes this weighted expectation that I have, that I feel like I'm not doing it right if I can't. So then when we remove that, and then offer a point of focus. So the point of focus might be your breath. Your point of focus might be a mantra. So like something really simple, like saying let in your mind as you inhale and go in your mind as you exhale. So it just gives you a little point of focus, and there's a gazillion mantras out there. It might be an image to look at. It might be listening to something or counting or whatever. So you find a point of focus, and then inevitably, so if you kind of think of it like a circle, so like you have your point of focus, there's going to be a distraction. All the distractions are going to be our sound in our environment, an emotion that we have internally, a physical sensation, or a thought. And so inevitably something is going to happen where we're distracted. And then we're like caught in that distraction a little bit, like, oh, I wish that horn would stop honking or whatever. So we're like stuck in that distraction phase. And then I'm distracted, right? Then we're like, oh, my mind isn't clear, whatever. Right. And once you notice it, you release it. Oh, it's just a sound. Or, oh, that's just a thought. That's just an emotion. That's just a body sensation. So you label whatever that is for what it is, and then you reconnect with your point of focus, breath, mantra, whatever. And you're going to be in that cycle for the entire practice. And that's why we call it practice, because it's hard to practice it. And we don't necessarily get good at it. We just get more adept at that process of recognizing the distraction and releasing it. So we might get caught in a story of a thought for a whole minute and then be like, oh, you know what? I was just, on this crazy train.
Right. Like, what time is it? Where am I? Yeah.
Let it go. And so that's the practice, is how much closer do we get that distraction to the releasing? Eventually, and I like to practice what's called choiceless awareness, where you're not trying to attend to anything, but notice it all. And so you're not telling your mind you can't think. You're not telling your body it can't have a sensation. You're just noticing what's there. And inevitably, the noise quiets, because it doesn't feel like it's not allowed to. Like, I'm not allowed to think. Like, oh, all I can do now is think. So that choiceless awareness just offers a witnessing experience where you're just kind of watching your experience unfolding. So rather than being the thinker of the thought, I'm a witness to that thought. And that creates a disconnection, no longer like a need to get caught in the story of it, which, like in yoga, we call that as mita, where it's the story of me. So we're like always creating these internal kind of soap operas or whatever. And so we're just connecting from that a bit in that process. And that just makes everything feel a lot more calm. But that labeling of the experience to just, oh, that's just a sound. Like, I don't need to attend to it. It doesn't have to distract me, right? It's just in the background. And I can still meditate even with the horn honking. So or even if I have a thought, that's okay. I just come back. And so this practice is just constant staying in that cycle. And so let's say your mind wanders 60 times in an average minute, and through your practice, maybe over a week or two, your mind is now wandering 40 times or 30 times. Still feels like a lot of thoughts. However, it's over time that you start to see that. So maybe then you find this space between your thoughts becomes wider and wider, or your recognition of the distraction to the releasing of it becomes wider and wider, until that becomes less of a thing, and you kind of sink more deeply into that meditative state where you're absorbed with that point of focus versus working at it. And in yoga, there's the steps are like, first you're in a concentrated state. First you need to relax. You need to have your nervous system calm with that state, the step 5. But then step 6, you are doing you're doing the concentration. So that's where you're linking with your point of focus. And that's where the effort is. But then once you move into the 7th step, you're in meditation. So that's when the veil sort of lifts and you're just connected to your point of focus. And there might be those dips still in and out, but you're not having to work so hard at it. And many of us stay in that concentration zone for a long time to practice that, because, there's a lot on our minds. And a lot of like noise, or it's just getting used to the practice. But when you start to find those spaces, it's really, really wonderful.
Yeah. And, I'll be honest, where I don't stay in the space for very long on most days, but I think where meditation has really helped me is shifting from judgment of myself and my thoughts to like more curiosity. So, this happened to me the other day. Actually, I was meditating and there was a fly in the room. And, I definitely got very caught in that distraction. And I thought about that scene in Eat, Pray, Love. Did you ever read that book? Where she's meditating and she's just being swarmed by mosquitoes? And she's like, I'm going to sit here and see if I can stay in my meditation without the distraction of the mosquitoes. So I almost thought about that, but I kind of watched my mind as this fly was like flying around me, and just about how I immediately judged it as bad and annoying and irritating. And then I was able to kind of pull away from that and be like, oh, that's interesting. Like, why does my mind automatically jump to that judgment? Why can't I just label it as an experience? I'm just here in an experience. And I kind of want to come full circle back to what this has to do with food and emotional eating, because I think when people are so caught and stuck in the negative judgment of themselves, yes, they turn to the numbing behavior, but also if food in and of itself, I feel like a lot of people are kind of like judging themselves around food having to do with their food story, if you will. And I think I always like to think like people who aren't there ready to meditate yet, they can sort of use their meals as like a microcosm of mindfulness, like a little meditation, and really help to kind of develop a more positive relationship with food, right? So I would love to hear your thoughts on tips and tricks for mindful eating and kind of like releasing the judgment around the eating experience in itself.
Yeah. So non-judgment is the point of mindfulness that I think we forget, right? Like, I can be here now, but if I'm judging the now, I'm not really being mindful. And so when you can be non-judgmental towards your food, and you can just say, here's my plate. And this is a great exercise for mindful eating, is to whatever you're eating, to be able to look at it and notice the judgments. So what do you like? Is this, oh, look, it's a salad, I'm superior. Or
yeah, I'm being good. Yeah,
exactly. Or it's a pizza, I'm bad, or this is a bad food, or whatever. And so as soon as we do that to the food, we're just striking something within our own ego that says I'm better than, or I'm worse than. And that because that's what judgment does, right? It's like constantly trying to toggle us superior, inferior, and that's what our ego kind of dance does all day long. And so when you can come away from that and say, it's just food, right? It's just food. It's a cookie, it's pizza, it's salad, whatever. It's just all food. And of course we want to nourish ourselves and make sure we're getting in the proper amount of vitamins and minerals and all that good stuff. But we're also nourish ourselves sometimes with pizza, right? But that if we're numbing with the pizza, that's a problem. But if we're saying, I like pizza and I enjoy the taste and it's enjoyable to eat this, it's pleasurable. If you can be present with that, that is mindfulness. If you can make a salad taste amazing and that really does light you up, you want that pleasure from your food and that brings you joy, then eat that and enjoy it. And that's where you can be really mindful. And so, but to not say it's good or it's bad, but it's just food. And so if you can start with the non-judgment so that immediately we don't internalize that, like now I'm good or now I'm bad, but I'm just eating. And then we can be more connected to our body. Because if I feel like this is the bad food and I'm a bad person, I'm more likely to overeat. And if I say that it's just food and I can enjoy it, and then I'm going to be much more connected to my hunger and full cues. I'm going to be more connected to how it tastes, or when I can stop or whatever. And so, and just like the portion sizes and all of that becomes more conscious because we're more connected to the food rather than it being, if it's bad food, I need to wolf it down so that I get it in really fast because like I'm being bad, and or if it's like a really bland, boring salad, but we feel like we're being good, like that doesn't really connect either. So it's just finding what is the right balance of nourishment and enjoyment with food and pleasure, but ensuring that the pleasure we're deriving from food isn't our sole form of pleasure. And also it's not numbing in the moment. It is more about, I am actually hungry. I want to enjoy this food. And then when you're doing it mindfully, you're engaging the senses. So you're taking in the aromas. What does it smell like? You're not distracted. There's not the TV and the social media and a whole bunch of other things going on. You're not driving. You're sitting and you're paying attention. You're being really non-judgmental. And then you're taking a bite. You're chewing slowly. You're tasting every bit of the food and enjoying that, savoring the experience of eating it. Because if this is bringing you pleasure, you want to remember that pleasure. You want to enjoy it the whole time. And then being able to check in. How am I feeling? Am I getting full? Do I want more? Am I still hungry? What's going on in my body? And when you can have that connection and it's not judgmental and it's not, forceful in some way in terms of restricting or overeating, but really being in that just really balanced space, you're going to feel good, right? You're going to feel like you're positive about what you're doing to nourish yourself, but also to give yourself pleasure in food. But you're really engaged and you're present. You're there. You're actually eating it. You're not like numbing and you're not distracted. And you're also not giving yourself these negative impressions or overly, like superior impressions. You're just you eating.
Right. And that's, I think, where the power of questions comes in, and the curiosity piece, and just to, keep having that kind of self-guided inquiry throughout the eating process can be really helpful. So when it comes to, I want to play devil's advocate for a second. What if someone is like, I don't really have anything else that brings me pleasure or joy, or I don't know what lights me up? What can they do to help figure that out?
Yeah. I say like, okay, well, that's fine. Like food can be like, look forward to your meals, make sure that they're balanced and all of that. However, I know there's got to be something else. So this is where we get really kind of float back. Like, was there a time like in your childhood that you remember really enjoying what you were doing, or what you were, an expression, or, is there a book that you read that you just loved? And like, is there like a style of whatever that decorating your home, or like, what do you love? Like right now that could bring some pleasure that might be outside. Like if people got much of their pleasure from travel or from going out or from a lot of social activity, people are are suffering, I think, way more than us introverts.
Right. Exactly. I'm like, oh, I like being able to kind of stay home and
yeah. So those finding, okay, well, how do you still have that? How do you have a Zoom party? How do you create the joy of decorating your space, or having, your physical space be something a bit more pleasurable? Or how do you maybe get back into a genre of books you liked to read, or like some type of creative outlet, or just really taking up cooking maybe during this time? And how do you bring in more kind of like high nutrient dense ingredients, and marry that with things that you love to eat and that flavors that you enjoy, and then find like, how does that bring you pleasure, but also that you can have pleasure in the process and not just in the eating, so that it becomes sort of a holistic experience with the cooking and the preparation, or maybe doing that with your partner or whatever. And so there's a lot of opportunity to create pleasure in these non-food ways and in food ways, so that there's the opportunity to really spread it out so that we're not just only seeking pleasure in food.
I love that. So my last question for you, given that I feel as if creating that morning routine is probably one of the most powerful things you can do, I would ask, what is your morning routine?
So
do you have one?
I do. I actually really enjoy just like drinking tea and like having just a little bit of space in the morning. And so for me, and I do have a fairly consistent meditation practice and movement and all of that, but those aren't things I necessarily do every day based on my schedule. But every day I enjoy a cup of tea and just allow that time and space in the morning to sort of like go over, what is my day going to be like? What is my plan? And so that I really formulate that, kind of gets me feeling like excited for the day when I kind of look at the day and like, what do I want to get accomplished, and how am I going to make all of these things happen today? And if I have like a big case that day, like what clients do I have, and kind of review through that. So it's just this kind of preparation experience with my tea that I enjoy in the morning. And then I try to make sure, where am I going to fit in these self-care elements that are so valuable that I teach everyone else to do, and then how do I remember to do them for myself? And so some days I'm busy back to back seeing clients, but then another day I'll make sure like I have a good chunk of time devoted to getting in some movement, getting in meditation, getting in some type of reading or writing or whatever else brings me a little bit of joy, so that I get that opportunity to do that as well.
Yeah, I love that. And I think when you can kind of create space and stillness, whether people have families or they're living by themselves, I think, just to carve out that space can help you develop a better relationship with yourself, whether you're actually putting pen to paper to journal, or you're just, reading a book, or you're just stepping outside with your coffee or tea just to get some morning light for like 5 minutes. You can just sort of, that peace that washes over you with that can just be like, help to assure you that you're okay. And that, if you say something positive to get your day started, that can be a really great thing to do.
That is a huge element of kind of also looking at the day and being like, okay, it's going to be a good day, or these are the things I'm looking forward to, or this is, so that there's also like a sense of anticipation that's very healthy about the day, not like, oh my God, I have this many hours or whatever. So we can get like the mindset shift is so powerful to be able to look at it from what am I looking forward to within the day, and how do I give myself that reassurance and motivation?
Right. And to train your brain to kind of notice the positive, and get that wheel of law of attraction started. But that is a different conversation for another day. Well, Sarah, so for anyone who is listening, watching, where can they find you if they wanted to reach out and connect?
Yeah, my website is holisticfoodtherapy.com, and that's holistic with a WH because it's for whole foods and whole person within the holistic word. And so I have a book available called Holistic Food Therapy also. It's a mindful approach to making peace with food, and it's the workbook style to kind of help go through these chapters on, investigating self-sabotage, nutrition, emotions. There's the creative piece, mindfulness, all of that is in there. And then I also have an online course that's Freedom from Emotional Eating. And it's also a mindful focus, and it's similar to the book, but it's expanded in a different way and more hands-on. I guess they're both kind of hands-on, but more, auditory. So lot of practices integrated.
Yeah, no, that's great. You're definitely what I would consider the emotional eating expert. So if anyone is struggling, that you are definitely the person to seek help from. So, well, thank you so much. This has just been such a great, insightful conversation again. And I can't wait to feature you on the Healthified magazine, and hopefully we can do this again one day.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, you have a good rest of your day, and we'll be in touch.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Bye, Sarah.
Bye.